How do we ensure that the Indo-Canadian Caribbean community's voices are heard? I'm here today with Ryan Singh, chair of the Indo-Caribbean Canadian Association, and we're going to talk about why government advocacy matters. Hi, Ryan.
Hey, Lee.
I am really happy that you're here today with me because we have done a lot of cool things together, but this initiative you're doing is so important.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. I know we've been trying to do this for a couple of months, but I have been busy, and I know we're going to talk about what's keeping me busy. So I appreciate you giving us a platform to talk about this.
Yeah, you've been busy with this organization. You've done a lot. And I just wanted us to take a moment to talk about why. Why did you create this organization?
Totally. So I never thought we would do this. I would like to say it's purely accidental. So sort of in the midst of the pandemic, even a little bit prior to the pandemic, there's a lot of stuff kind of stirring in my head. My own racial identity, where do I fit in? A person who was a racialized MPP, member of provincial parliament, was on the phone with him, and he said, when you get a census, what box do you check? And it's true. There's so many times I get surveys or censuses, and I don't know what box to check off. There's not a box. I'm always the other. So I thought about why that issue was so important to me, to understanding my history, my community. Fast forward a little bit into 2020, the murder of George Floyd happened. And that was almost a racial revolution, if you will. And I think a lot of racialized people, we stopped to think about our relationship with the Black community, understanding ourselves, and then how do we actually work together to resolve racialized issues. And part of that was developing a further thought process of who I am and where I come from and how do I define myself. So I'm always the type of person that says, I'm Canadian. I was born here, I'm Canadian first. I know when people see me, they see a brown guy. So there's a little bit more to just being a Canadian. There's a history. And I know you had former Premier Kathleen Wynne on here, and she said, technically, whether we were first or second generation immigrants, everybody came from somewhere else. So I met up with some friends, and in that conversation we talked about the complexities of being Indo-Caribbean, which is sort of a new evolving term. And, when people see us, they automatically think you're from India. And that's a fair assessment, but there's so much more about us. And then when you tell them you're from the Caribbean, there's so many people who are like, oh, you're Black. And I'm not Black. I don't want to misrepresent the Black community or myself. So along the lines of people not understanding us wanting to learn more about ourselves, we identified issues that emerge when Indo-Caribbean people aren't properly recognized. Part of that, it goes back to if there is a Caribbean event or Caribbean programming or services, they tend to be Afrocentric, Afro-led, which is fine. We are advocates for Black space, but we simply don't belong there. On the flip side, if we try to leverage South Asian programming or services, most of us only speak English. So those aren't offered to us. And at times we are simply not welcomed in those spaces, which is a whole other podcast. So we thought the first thing that we should do is educate people about who Indo-Caribbean people are, where you can access Indo-Caribbean food, culture right here in the city. It started in May 2020 on Instagram. And it's blown up ever since. We're doing community programming. We're doing fundraising. We have a full-on board. It's turned into an organization. So that's the long version to why we started it, and how it began.
I think it's an important story to tell because it's who we are, right? Like as a Toronto, like when they say, oh, we are a world within a city, but we are all unique, right? And the fact that you said, oh, this just started as an idea on Instagram and then it's blown up. It certainly speaks to the fact that there was a need or there was a void that needed to be filled. And knowing who you are as a human being, anything that you set your mind to, you're so authentic. You're someone who's like, oh, wait, I see a gap, or I see a voice missing at the table. And in your history, in your experience, being a government advocate, right? Like being a government relations person, you know the power of it. And I almost, if it's fair to say, recognizing that you don't see yourself represented at these tables while you advocate for other people.
Exactly.
I think must have been something that you're like, wait a minute, we got to change that.
Yeah. So I'm a big proponent of diversity in politics and government. I feel that government shouldn't just reflect the people it serves, but it needs to respond to the people it serves. How does it respond to the people it serves? It needs to have people that look like its constituency at the table, around the table. And there has been strides, but there's still more work to be done. And you're right, like I don't do a lot of self-reflection about who I am, but sort of talking about myself more recently, I am the type of person that tries to, I shouldn't say try to, but sometimes accidentally finds gaps and says, what can we do to resolve this issue? What can we do to move forward on a specific topic or area? Most of the time, it's about representation. It's making sure that underrepresented communities have a seat at the table, that their voices are heard, that different perspectives are brought. And, you know, I'm also a believer that once you have multiple perspectives around the table, whether it's a cabinet table, a committee, you make better decisions, right? You have varying perspectives. Having a one thought process simply doesn't work, and it doesn't support broader communities. So yeah, I saw an opening and an opportunity and a need for servicing Canada's Indo-Caribbean community. And it's been an amazing journey ever since. I've met some wonderful people, and I think we've built something really, really beautiful.
So before we go on further, may I ask, how do you identify? Like we talk about being Indo-Caribbean, but like where the Caribbean, because Caribbean's also great.
Yeah. So a bit of background. So I was born in Canada. I identify as Canadian.
Yeah.
I know some people hyphenate, Guyanese Canadian, Trinidadian Canadian. I'm simply Canadian, but I come from an Indo-Caribbean household. So when we talk about a multicultural society, we talk about people of different cultures. My culture is Indo-Caribbean. So the music I listen to, the food I eat, cultural customs, they're molded by where my ancestors came from. Yeah. My parents immigrated from Guyana in the 1980s. And my great-great-grandparents would have come from India in sort of the early 1900s. And they came over as indentured workers. I am still doing a lot of work trying to map out where my ancestors originated from and more sort of background about that, but it's difficult. There's not a lot of documentation on that.
I just wanted to take a moment to show this logo because I think it's a pretty powerful logo. So this logo, can you talk a little bit about this logo? Yeah.
So there's sort of two icons that are meshed together. So on the left, it's a sugar cane. So our ancestors were brought from India to the Caribbean to cultivate on the plantation fields and harvest. And then the second is a maple leaf. So the maple leaf is significant because we want to be a Canadian association that brings together the community here in Canada. That logo is bringing together those two identities into one spot. The red, obviously red is very Canadian, but part of learning about who I am and the pain and suffering of our ancestors, there was a lot of blood. And I think when a lot of us think about ancestors who were enslaved or served as indentured workers, we know there was a lot of sadness and a lot of toil. So that's why that red's there. The gold is also very specific as well. A lot of our ancestors were lured to the Caribbean on promises of wealth and gold and prosperity that didn't actualize. A lot of these countries are rich in gold. Our direct ancestors didn't necessarily benefit from that, though. Eventually, gold was found, and there's gold mining in Guyana. But that's why that logo. And thanks for the compliments on the logo. But that's why that logo is the way it is.
Yeah, and I think that's really powerful, right? Because everything is a symbol and there's a history behind that symbol. So let's talk about the Indo-Caribbean Canadian Association because you've done some really cool things, mentorship.
Yep.
advocacy, right? Can we talk a little bit about those things?
Yeah. So in our first years, we're starting in COVID. We're working very virtually. We teamed up with other Caribbean and Indo-Caribbean organizations to do a winter clothing drive. We identified that there are many immigrants from the Caribbean who come to Canada and they don't realize they need hats, mitts, gloves. I was born here and I sometimes don't realize how many layers I need. So we had about 20 to 25 locations. That was Caribbean restaurants, grocery stores, temples, churches that took boxes where people could donate gently used items or new items. And we worked with a community group in St. Jamestown. When we did that project, I really saw the power and the interest of the community coming together to serve other people in the community. So the following year, we did a book drive. We leveraged the same organizations. We had boxes at all these locations. We filled 6 barrels of books. 3 went to Trinidad and 3 went to Guyana. So again, we saw the power of if you provide opportunity for people to give, opportunity for people to get involved, they come. Sort of maneuvering in that time in between, there were elections happening. So I took to our Instagram page and I put out go vote, just a simple go vote message. What do you bring at a voting station? The times are open, etc. And I realized there is a need for educating our community about elections and being civically involved. So we launched something called Voice, the voter organization for Indo-Caribbean engagement. So it's technically an acronym, but Voice is also giving our community a voice. We do different projects to educate the community about government, how to access government. We've done educational pieces on the election itself, informing them of candidates. We also try our best to engage with candidates from the community because we think it's important that people see people from the community who are putting their names on a ballot. We're not saying you need to vote for them, but they need to see that we're engaged, we're involved. And I think for me, that will hopefully inspire other people to become engaged and involved. 2 other initiatives I want to talk about. So Starby, which is kind of a Guyanese Trinidadian slang that means you're sort of like, if a guy wears sunglasses, he's all dressed up, he's a starby, right? It's okay. You're like a big actor or something.
Yeah.
But it's a term that we use for our mentorship program for young boys. So we have a couple of moms in the organization, and they said there are a lot of accounts for Indo-Caribbean women and young girls. There's programming. There's a lot of focus on women, and we need that. Unfortunately, there was nothing made space for boys. And, parents and family members, they always like to say, oh, if these younger boys had more opportunity, maybe they would have turned out differently, or maybe they would have aspired to be something else. And sometimes at that point, it's too late. So what we discussed is, how do we create a space for young boys in our community to be mentored by males in the community? Again, I go back to, it's important for these young men to see other young men who are successful, who have made it in different fields and different sectors. Our community is plagued by stereotypes. And one of those stereotypes is that, you grow up, you have a mediocre job, and you go partying and you're always drinking at a bar, right? People don't realize the success stories from our community. Even people in our community don't see those success stories. So we wanted to pair bringing together those success stories to inspire the younger generation. So that's why we created Starby. And we've had a series of mentors who come in. We've done different workshops, from arts and crafts to lawyers talking about a law career, to we had a pop music star from Guyana last week. And it's great to also show them the diversity. So they don't feel they have to grow up to be a doctor or a lawyer, but they know that the world's theirs and they could pursue any career and be successful. Their race, their culture, nothing should hinder them. And the last one I want to talk about is EPIC. So something I'm really proud about. So EPIC actually is another acronym, Equality and Pride for Indo-Caribbeans. And that word works really well because I would like to say the work that we're doing is really epic. Our community is plagued by a history of homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia. In some of the Caribbean countries, being gay or lesbian is a death penalty. But we need to recognize here in Canada, we have a role to play in equality.
Yeah.
And that starts with our own community. I've met several young people who come to us at our events and they simply say thank you. And that's all I need to fuel me. They struggle because if they go to a Caribbean event, they can't be openly gay or lesbian, right? If they are at a queer event, they feel underrepresented, right? They're predominantly white, cis, male spaces. Their two worlds rarely come together. So when we do our annual Pride Social, so we've done 2 Pride Socials now, to see them dancing our cultural music, but at the Well on Wellesley Street, on Church Street, you know, somebody said they never thought they would hear chutney music. So that's music from our community. They never hear chutney music being played on Church Street, right? So when our work is fairly epic, we are paving a space that's inclusive where people can truly be themselves and feel safe.
Yeah.
So I'm really proud of all of that we're doing, and we're doing so much more, but I'm pretty sure you have more questions. So,
well, I mean, no, I thank you, because I think this is something that's really important to be reflective. And for me, my intent is really to showcase the voices that I think need to be heard and celebrate the leadership. And you have always been a change maker. You have always been thinking about how to elevate every situation and to fill those gaps and to create new spaces.
Yeah.
So this is why I'm really happy that you're here with me today, because your leadership is amazing.
Can I speak about it a little bit?
Please.
So I've had to do a couple of speeches here and there about what drives me in terms of what I do. And, you know, I don't have a time machine, so I can never go back to seeing when our ancestors were herded and put on boats and brought over. And I keep thinking, why did those people agree to get on boats to come over to a new world? On the other side of the planet, they didn't have phones and technology, right? They were just told they're going to go on an 8-month boat ride and they're going to end up in a whirl. And their vision was prosperity for the next generation. They went through a lot of pain and torture. They were tricked. They were turned into slaves and indentured workers. They toiled, but they didn't do that for themselves in that moment. They were doing it because they thought about a future generation. I also think about our living ancestors. So our parents and our grandparents. You know, I had a conversation with somebody and we were talking about a lot of our parents left their own families to come to Canada. Yeah. This cold, frigid country from these tropical, beautiful countries that they left. And why did they leave? They left to seek a better life, not for themselves necessarily, because I know my parents worked really, really hard when they were here. But they wanted their future children. They didn't know myself and my sister would exist. They did it for their future children. So the work that we do is inspired by our ancestors and what they did. Yeah. And somebody said to me, remember, Ryan, you are somebody's ancestor. And the work I'm doing, I hope, will have a positive impact for future generations. You know, sort of being sometimes segregated or misunderstood or not finding place. Hopefully in a generation or two, they won't have those struggles because of the work that we've done. I think it's incumbent on every generation to strive to do more to set up success for the future. So how my parents gave an opportunity for myself and my sister, our ancestors came over from India to the Caribbean. They really laid the groundwork for my success here. And I think I have a role to play at making sure that we don't just let that go to waste, but we build upon that.
Absolutely. I totally feel you on that, because I mean, I'm Chinese, but my parents are from India and their family had left China for a better future for them. And my parents came to Canada, leaving their families to build a better future. And so I think that's a story that resonates with so many people in Canada.
Absolutely.
Right? I really appreciate that. Well, one of the things is we've had the opportunity to celebrate a major festival, Diwali.
Yep.
And I know that this is a bit of a catalyst for you in terms of shining light, spreading light. Can we talk a little bit about your latest advocacy project?
Yep. So last year, municipal elections were happening and I was being approached by a number of candidates, as you probably were, to work on their municipal campaigns. And I looked at the calendar and I realized the municipal election date was the same day as Diwali. And for me, Diwali is about time to spend with family. It is a religious and cultural observance. I love some of our candidates, but I'm not going to give up time with my parents and my family for an election. And, you know, as much as I'm involved in politics and passionate about government, being with my family couldn't divide that. So I thought about other people who had to, the average citizen, choose between going to a ballot box and then choose between going to their family. Because Lee, like, you know, Diwali is usually typically celebrated in the evening.
Yeah.
And when do people typically vote? When they come home after work.
Yeah.
But if you come home after work and you have to do prayers and you have family coming over and you have to cook dinner or go to your Gurdwara or Mandir, you're not going to prioritize voting that night. So I launched a petition through the Indo-Caribbean Canadian Association, and we wrote a letter to the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing, recommending that the day of the election be moved so there is no conflict. And it's not just Hindus. Some Buddhists, Jains, and Sikhs also have observances on that day as well. So approximately 1 million South Asians in Ontario would have been impacted by this. The day before the election itself, Brampton saw about 150 poll workers quit the night before because people were like, wait, what are you doing tomorrow? Oh, I'm going to work at the polling station. No, you're not. It's Diwali. It's Bandhani Chor. It's like, you can't go work, right? There was a problem there. And that problem represented probably thousands of people who prioritize being with their family for these holidays rather than going out to vote. The minister, we never got a response, a positive response about changing the election date. We did point out that there is precedent in Ontario. So in 2007, the McGuinty government had asked the chief electoral officer to forecast if there was because there was a religious holiday scheduled for the said election. It was a Jewish observance. So the general thought was, let's bump the election to the week after. The week after would have been the start. So that Tuesday, the 11th would have been, Thursday, the 11th would have been the start of Eid. So they said, we can't have an election then. So they actually moved it, because we're legislated to be Thursdays. Yep. They moved it to a Wednesday because they realized having an election on both those days is problematic, does deter people from voting. Right now, the Elections Act in Ontario prescribes the chief electoral officer to move the election date if he or she sees fit, being a religious or cultural observance of significance. The Municipal Elections Act doesn't have that provision. So looking forward, our hope is that if a government, whether it's this current government or a future Ontario government, enshrines the same ability for the chief electoral officer to prescribe that there is a major cultural or religious event and that we should be moving the election date. I don't think it's a big ask. I think in a province, in a country as diverse as ours, everybody likes to say diversity is your strength, but diversity is only your strength if it's engaged and involved, right? We're not just workers, right? We're not just taxpayers. We are active citizens, but you also have to make sure that you set up space for us to be active citizens. Having an election day in Diwali deters that. Really briefly, the suggestion of advanced polls, because I know you're into politics. I had a problem with people saying just go vote at advanced polls, because that robs us of time to make a decision for a candidate. And in a municipal election, you're voting for a mayor, a councillor, potentially a regional councillor, and a trustee. So you're voting for up to 4 people on one ballot. How many people ran for mayor? 100 people? Yeah. Right? So there's multitudes of candidates. So people need time. They need time to meet their candidates, understand the issues. By prescribing that they go to an advanced poll, simply suggests that, one, there is an issue on that date that deters them from voting, but then says you don't deserve as much time as your peers. Go vote early, right? Voting in advance is like, oh, I know I'm going to Hawaii next week. I got to go vote early. Exactly. Right? It's not for 1 million people who are going to be disenfranchised because of their religious and cultural observance. So I think that's a really important point to make, because viewers watching this will say, why not just vote early?
Right.
But that to me is very problematic.
But you've already outlined the fact that there is a precedence of other cultures having the election date moved for a result of their observances. And so it almost sets up, again, a second-class citizenship.
Yep. Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
And then say, oh, well, why don't you say to the other groups? Like, I think that's important that we live in a society that, that values and respects, but people not by word, but by action.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I was asked a question by a news reporter if I think the government's being racist.
Okay.
I don't think the government's being racist. What I do think is that it's incumbent on any government to modernize and upkeep laws to what I said earlier, reflect its citizenry, right? Reflect its population it's meant to serve. We've updated gender identification on driver's license, right? There was a rule in the early 1900s that said women are persons, right? There's always this evolution of government recognizing that there are major cultural or religious events happening that might disenfranchise people from being engaged, and changing that so we can accommodate that. That is part of the evolution, right? But government needs to understand that, and government needs a will to do it. Some governments do it. They do it proactively. Sometimes people don't appreciate it, but we need to be that forward thinking. I think if I was in the provincial government right now, I would look simply at the elections that governs the provincial election, copy and paste that section and put it in the municipal act.
So how do we do that? Like, you know what I mean? Like, you copy and paste it and put it in the act, right? You wrote a letter on behalf of the organization and did not receive a response, or you did not receive a favorable response?
It was also the period where they could have changed it. We didn't receive a response. We received the response after the election. So it was kind of too late at that point. The answer at that point was that the date's legislative.
Right.
And Lee, you know me and the office I worked in. I understand legislation really, really well. You just have to amend the legislation.
Yeah.
For something that important, I am pretty sure all 3 or 4 political parties at Queen's Park would have agreed to this. Pushing it one day, pushing it a week. I don't think it was a big ask, but government needs to have a will to do it.
Exactly. It's the will to do it. So how do we ensure that this doesn't happen again?
We're planning to advocate now that we have some time. I don't foresee in the future, because Diwali moves, that there might be an instance where Diwali overlaps again. But for municipal election and federal acts or election acts, we should forecast the event where there might be a major religious event that conflicts. So if there is a federal election in February or March, we should avoid Chinese New Year's, Nowruz, Eid. But government needs to enshrine that in their legislation. So we're going to start with some advocacy. And then I think we need to elect more people that look like us and that are from the community, because it goes back to what I said. If the table has people that are representative of the diverse population, those are ideas already there. Those advocates are already there. So it kind of goes two-way. We need grassroots. We need grassroots advocacy, but then we also need to make sure that people who understand the issues, people who are from the communities, have a seat at the table, are offering those insights at that table. I
think it's really important. I'm glad that we are talking about this, because as a kid growing up, even celebrating Chinese New Year, for instance, which is like a 10-day holiday, back in China and all this stuff, my parents who are Chinese would feel like I have to choose between putting food on the table or celebrating a major holiday. And often they would defer to, we'll celebrate it later, and push the cultural holiday off for years and years and years. And even very recently, when my kid was in school and Chinese New Year was happening, they scheduled an event to happen. And I was like, well, my kid isn't going to be able to participate because we won't be here. And I was so sad. And it was more like, I don't think it was done intentionally. It was just an oversight. Yep. And the TDSB has a whole list of national observances from different cultures. And I was like, did anybody look at that calendar? But it's not just that one instance, but we think about who is in power, who's in decision-making tables, yep. and we're not always reflective.
Yeah.
We're not reflected in those spaces, so people don't naturally think. And I see this in, for instance, people who hold events. They will do an event and not even realize, wait a minute, we're going to be hosting something on a major cultural holiday that is actually geared towards people of that community. Absolutely. I won't mention who it is, but it's very frustrating.
It is. So relevant to you and me, I mean, Ontario should look at New York State. They have actually made Chinese New Year's and Diwali a public holiday in their public school system. Okay. So students who celebrate either of those, or both, because there's some mixed households, could be excused from school and not feel penalized for missing school to observing a major holiday with their family. So there are movements around the world happening, especially in North America. So as you were talking about that, it reminded me of what New York State just did.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's important that it comes down to having members who represent different cultures to vote and to vote in members like that. But I think that we have bigger systemic issues.
Absolutely.
Because you and I do not represent the majority of the people who are active and engaged folks. Absolutely. We were often the only people of color at many decision-making tables.
Absolutely.
And I don't know how we became that way. We're anomalies for sure. But how do we change that? Right. And that's how do we change that?
Well, what we're trying to do through Voice within the Indo-Caribbean community is teach people about the impact of government. Right. I like to say from the moment you wake up and get out of bed to that moment when you go back to sleep, the water you turn on your taps, the roads you drive on, the healthcare you use, the school you drop your children at, the environment around you, the trees, the air. Government has an influence on all of those aspects. And depending on who's in government, those things might change. So if you have a certain vision for your community or for your broader country, you should get involved. You should understand how government's making decisions. You might be involved right now and not agree with something happening, right? That's even more opportunities. So if you want to show folks the other pamphlet, we've just launched this pamphlet. We're dropping it off about 50 locations across the GTA, and inside really educates people about municipal, provincial, and federal government. It lets them know what each of them does and how to access their politicians appropriately. Yeah. If you have an issue that is your garbage is not getting picked up, right?
Yeah.
Then you need to call your city councilor, not your federal member of parliament, right? There's little things and then there's big things. And having people understand and have more awareness helps them understand the severity and the importance of having people elected who understand them and represent them. So this is part of our project that we're doing, is getting these pamphlets out to people so we can educate them, and hopefully that will be a pathway for them to get more involved and more engaged.
And we'll have a link on this on the website for sure. I mean, I think that's really important, and having a pathway of why should it matter that I vote?
Yep.
Right. I think it starts as simple as go out and vote because it matters, and helping people understand that. But it's also for people who are willing to put their name forward.
Yep.
It's not easy.
No.
Right? Because you often have to take a pay cut. You don't have a security of a pension. And you are working with with a diverse array of constituents where you may not know. You're not going to please them.
Yep.
You're going to piss a whole bunch of people off. Sorry, pardon me.
It's okay. It's true. I mean, first and foremost, there's tons of risks associated with running, time off from work, the prospect of losing, not having employment, that period when you're electioneering and campaigning, you don't see your family. Those are barriers for people of color. because we don't have certain advantages.
Yeah.
And it is challenging. And I mean, I know all political parties do their best to recruit, but I think if those barriers were eliminated, we'd have so many more people involved in politics. The salary, there's a lot of qualified people who look at the salary and the prospect of no pension if you're a provincial member. That impacts them deciding to run or not. So again, another barrier for people, because our families don't necessarily have years of generational wealth to rely on. There were the last point you mentioned there, and I can't remember what it was now. Oh, about getting involved. So I found no matter where we run a racialized candidate, they will always feel some level of racial or racism, racial stigma. Yeah. I was supporting a friend of mine who was Chinese, and she showed me some of the emails she got, and I was blown away. And it was in North Scarborough, in a place that is predominantly Chinese, Asian, and generally immigrants. Some of the language she was hating. I publicly endorsed her. I started getting emails saying that I was betraying my own community by supporting an Asian candidate. That discourages people from running. Yeah. I said it was a woman on top of it. That is another barrier to getting qualified candidates. We have tons of women who are super qualified, tons of women of color who are super qualified to run, but those additional barriers hold them back. And it's unfortunate. I don't think it's something we can solve overnight. Yeah. But we need to be smart about how do we get people involved? How do we get people engaged? And how do we make it easier for them to make that leap into politics? Yeah. We've seen several successful people of color in politics. Yeah. But there could be so much more.
Absolutely. Ryan, there's so much more that we could go with this, but I wanted to, our time is short, so we'll have to have another conversation, but I always love to end on a favorite quote. And the quote you sent me, don't boil the ocean. Yep. I've never heard this one, so please tell me, where's that come from? Why?
I can't remember who said it to me, but the way I operate is don't take too much on. Start with something small. Be focused, stay committed, and be successful. Don't boil the ocean is literally, you can't fit an ocean in a pot and put it on a stove. Put a little bit of water in the pot and boil it. It'll boil, right? So it's not necessarily an environmental quote that we're not, but I'm obviously an advocate for climate change and we need initiatives to protect the oceans. But it's be practical and be focused. Don't take too much on. And you will find success. Find the one goal that you want. We get people all the time who tell us, oh, you should do this, you should do that, you should do this. I'm like, all of this sounds great, but I only have 2 hands and 24 hours on the clock. I can only do so much. So we have a couple of programs. We're going to keep pushing. We're going to want to do them better. We're going to recruit more volunteers. When we have more capacity, we'll do more. But to anybody who's getting into community advocacy, anybody who wants to start their own organization, start small. Have a big vision, but start small and then build on your success. So don't try to boil the ocean.
I love it. Thank you. Wise words from Ryan Singh.
Thanks, Lee. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Thanks for checking out this episode. You want to make sure to like, subscribe, and share so that you don't miss out on the next In Focus episode on topics that matter to you.